Armenian Genocide, and it's been wonderful every year. He is currently the High and Isabel Berberian Professor of Armenian Studies at Cal State Fresno, which knows a thing or two about Armenians. Prior to that, he was a lecturer in Armenian and Religious Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. His doctorate was conferred by Harvard University with honors in Near Eastern languages and civilizations. And today he will again present a commanding portrayal of the circumstances and causes of the Armenian Genocide, and I would wager it's as comprehensive a treatment of that subject as you will hear in less than 2 hours. So please welcome Professor Sergio La Porta.
Thank you, Diane. It's always a pleasure to come here. It's always been edifying for me, as well as a pleasant experience getting to meet the community and the students here, as well as colleagues at Sonoma State. When I was looking over the program for the series, the 2019 series, I was coming to grips with the fact of my own students not having a real sense of what I would consider for my own, because since I lived through my own present history, where we were just talking about it, 9/11 seems a long time ago. They don't have living memory of it. The Soviet Union, which loomed large over my youth, where we still had desks that could protect you from nuclear weapons. They don't make those anymore. Just is also a distant memory that isn't present in people's lives. And so one of the questions that I think needs to be asked is why are certain things still relevant? And especially after it's been over 100 years. Right? 2015 marked the centenary of the Armenian Genocide. It's been over 100 years. And in the meantime, obviously, we are aware of the fact that other genocides have occurred, but other genocides are occurring right now. So why are we sitting in a hall talking about something that happened over 100 years ago when Uyghurs are getting thrown into prison camps or re-education camps in China, and the Rohingya are getting slaughtered in Myanmar, right? And in Syria, we know about the constant onslaught against various ethnic groups, including Christians and Yazidis, right? And in Sudan, again, various groups, including Darfuris, are being ethnically cleansed. So, with all of this going on, each year I'm asked to present something on the Armenian Genocide, and knowing that these other ones, and that we have genocide survivors coming here to lecture, and here I am. The worst thing I've had to deal with in my life is sort of like a delayed subway in New York. I've always felt sort of have to justify my own reason for doing this and presenting to you somewhat academic, but hopefully also a lecture that will get you to question about what are the lessons that we can learn from it. How is what happened 100 years ago, or over 100 years ago now, applicable today? So to begin with, I'd just like to start with some basic facts about the Armenian Genocide, just in case. So let me just ask a question. How many of you have studied the Armenian Genocide in school previously to this? Okay, that's in the United States. I always ask that question because it's surprising to me. It's mandated by law in the state of California. You were supposed to have studied the Armenian Genocide at some point in your high school curriculum. This is one of the problems that we're facing. And I know I've talked to teachers where they said, listen, I know I'm supposed to teach it, but I don't know how to teach it. I don't know what to teach. The textbooks don't include it. The textbooks aren't made in California, therefore they don't have to be included. The genocide doesn't have to be included, or the textbooks will refer to it as the alleged or supposed genocide, and here the state of California has put into the curriculum that you're teaching the Armenian Genocide. So just because I realize that that's not always filtering down to every single student. This is not a problem as much in a place like Fresno, where there's a large Armenian population that makes sure that it does get taught, but in other areas it still hasn't really made it. So I'd like to start with a few basic facts. The first one is just so that we know that on April 24th, 1915, 250 Armenian intellectuals in the Ottoman Empire were arrested and then soon executed. This is now the commemoration date for the Armenian Genocide every year. April 24th is the day on which it's commemorated, because it's at this point that we actually see the plan to exterminate the Armenian population of the Ottoman Empire put into place by, first of all, taking out the leaders of the community. Right? If you can get rid of the thinkers, the politicians, the religious clergy who lead the community, then it's much easier to dispense of the rest of the population afterwards, because it's hard for them to rally behind anyone. Between 1915 and 1923, approximately 1.5 million people were killed, 800,000 in the first 4 months. That's a rate of 200,000 people a month. I'll come back to that number, but that is standard in most genocides as a number. We see that in other genocides as well, of 200,000 people a month. Which makes them particularly difficult to stop once they've started. It occurred in the Ottoman Empire under the direction of the ruling Committee for Union and Progress, known as the CUP party. So they were the head of that government, the ones who put the orders into place, and we'll be talking about that too. And it is a defining moment of Armenian history, but I do like to emphasize that it is not the defining moment, right? And I'll get into that as well. Armenians had a long history before the genocide, and they'll have a long history after it. And so it will always be an important marking point in the history of the Armenian people, but it's not the thing that defines them. And then finally, and probably most difficult for Armenians, is that the Republic of Turkey denies it happened. Right? They say there was no genocide. For a long time, they just said Armenians didn't even exist here. It then shifted to, okay, they lived here, but we never killed them. Then it went to, they lived here, they killed us, and so we had to defend ourselves, to now the most common one was, yes, it happened during World War I, and things were unclear and mistakes were made. But it wasn't a genocide. So some people got killed accidentally, and it's a shame, but a lot of people died in World War I. We have to remember that. And so that's those are some of the main lines of denialist argument. Okay. One thing, on the other hand, is that the Armenian genocide is recognized as genocide by the most important scholars of genocide studies, including the International Association of Genocide Scholars, the International Center for Transitional Justice, the La Wiesel Foundation for Humanity, political organizations such as the European Parliament, Council of Europe, World Council of Churches, 27 countries in the Vatican City, not the United States. We don't officially recognize it as a country, although 48 out of the 50 states now do recognize. I think we're still at 48 this year of the 50 states still recognize it as happening. And this is the Armenian Genocide Monument that was erected in commemoration of the centenary in 2015 at Fresno State. So there is greater acceptance and recognition of it around the world and throughout the United States, but it still remains an issue for the Republic of Turkey. And most, I would say, for me, I don't want to say exciting, but at least the most promising, is by Turkish scholars who are re-examining their past. And I mean by citizens of Turkey. Some of them are ethnically Turkish, some of them are ethnically Kurdish, some of them are ethnically Arab. But they're coming to terms with what happened at the beginning of the 20th century, and they're re-examining their own history and trying to, let's say, deconstruct the myths of the modern Republic of Turkey and by forcing the issue of the Armenian genocide. And that's a really dangerous, I would say, a really dangerous program for them. Some of them wind up in jail. As you may know, right now, the Republic of Turkey is not the easiest place to live, particularly if you're an intellectual or a journalist. People are being jailed all the time, and their careers are being ruined. These people really are to be commended, and they're doing not only, I would say, good activist work. More importantly, in my opinion, they're really doing good scholarship. A lot of them are outstanding scholars as well, and I'm really happy to call them my friends, because they're also nice people. Okay. The other thing that I want to point out is that the Armenian genocide was instrumental in the definition of the word, in the creation of the word genocide. The word genocide did not exist in 1914, right, on the eve of the Armenian genocide. So when you look at the newspaper and articles and the papers of the time, they don't use the word. And this is something that denialists would often have pointed to. They used to say, like, look, nobody ever called it a genocide. That's because the word didn't exist. Right? So they talk about mass extinction, mass murder, the extermination of a people. And you can see how these authors are trying to come to grips with the destruction that is going on. It is only in 1944 that a Polish Jewish jurist named Raphael Lemkin coins the word genocide. Right? I'm sure maybe you learned this in your class about the killing of a people. And it's based on his own personal experience of the Holocaust and the death of his family, as well as his study, because even before the Holocaust, he had been interested in crimes against humanity. And one of his key cases was the Armenian genocide. So it was instrumental in his formulation of the word, and it's therefore intrinsic, in, the Armenian example is intrinsic to the very topic itself. Okay, but who are the Armenians? I mean, we often talk about genocides, and I don't like to present peoples as victims solely because they have agency, they have a history, they have an existence, and so it often helps to get to know them. How many people here actually know Armenians? Know an Armenian? Okay, wow, okay, that's good. That's a lot of people. That's nice. And possibly you also know something about Armenian food, right? Maybe people are familiar with pilaf, right? Or lahmacun, dolma, right? Kebab, all right? If you're not, go out and get some. It's really good. You may be familiar with Armenians through other media, such as music in particular, right? If you're a classical music fan, Aram Khachaturian and his saber dance is one of the classic standards for all classical music lessons. If you like the drums, you may have used a Zildjian cymbal at one point in your life. They are Armenians who have cornered the cymbal market for a long time. If you are more into sort of chanson, Charles Aznavour, who just passed away at an advanced age in his 90s, has a remarkable voice, was a troubadour for decades in France and also here. He came here numerous times. And then, of course, finally, probably most familiar to everybody, System of a Down. If you like that sort of music, it's great. So maybe you're familiar with Armenians that way. Or since I'm from Fresno, I have to say, you know, one of America's greatest writers, William Saroyan, who was from Beatles, his family's from Beatles, outside of Beatles, even though he grew up and wrote in Fresno. Also was, you know, pride of the Armenian people. Now, and this is, you know, well and good. Armenians have other factors to self-identity. I mean, these are all people who have made contributions to the current diasporic life of Armenia. We'll get back to that as well. But for Armenians, they also take pride in their long history, right, which they trace back to Mount Ararat. And that's the picture there where Noah's Ark, according to the Bible, was supposed to have landed. And that the Armenians settled in the shadows of Mount Ararat. And it's painful for Armenians today that that mountain, which is really symbolic for them of their homeland, is not in the Republic of Armenia, but is in the Republic of Turkey. You can see it very clearly from Armenia, but you can't actually go to it if you're in Armenia. But their long history that stretches back 3,000 years is something of great pride for them. Also, their Christian faith, Mac. That they're the first Christian nation in the sense that their leaders, their rulers, the kings, the Arsacids kings accepted Christianity at the beginning of the 4th century and made it their official religion of the country. Prior to that, they had a sort of syncretistic pagan Zoroastrian faith. They adopted Christianity and quickly the nobility, a large portion of the nobility converted, and then over time the entire population did, but it became the official religion of the Armenian kingdom. It has its own church. It's the Armenian Apostolic Church with its own head known as the Catholicos, which is the equivalent of the Pope in some ways, right, who resides in Echmiadzin in Armenia. Now, they are in dialogue with the other churches, the Roman Catholic Church, the Greek Orthodox Church, but they are separate. Their theology is not, and their practice is not very different, but they have some unique practices and some unique theological positions. And they're also proud of their language. Right? It's a language that's been spoken for over 2 millennia and has had a written experience since the 5th century CE. In 406, a monk named Mesrop Mashtots, I tell my students like mashed potatoes, mashed tots, invented an alphabet for Armenian. This was recorded by one of his students, and it's actually quite remarkable. We don't really know for most languages how their alphabet was created. And most languages actually don't have an alphabet. So English does not have its own alphabet. We don't use an English alphabet. We use what's originally a Phoenician alphabet that's been adapted for Greek, Latin, and eventually the English language. The Armenians did try to use other alphabets, and they didn't work. Armenian has 36 sounds, so they have 36 letters in their alphabet. Compared to what I think we have 26. I can never remember how many we have. So there are 10 more sounds. And the Greek and Hebrew alphabets have 22 letters. So they needed more letters, and they sort of created their own alphabet. And it's still in use today in the Republic of Armenia, and also in the diaspora. So Armenians are very fond of their alphabet. They have statues dedicated to the monument. You can buy statues dedicated to the alphabet. You can buy souvenirs of the alphabet, and it's a marker. If you see Armenian letters, right, you know Armenians are there. And so it becomes a very important cultural marker for them as well. And then finally there's a homeland dispersion or diaspora tension. That's also a significant marker of identity. That Armenians, wherever they are in the world, have assimilated or have at least acculturated to where they live and have become productive members of these dispersed communities and diaspora communities, but they have a memory and they have a desire for a homeland, which may be the Republic as it is today, or it may be a very different sort of idea of what they think that homeland should be. But that is a part of their identity. And recently, I don't know if any of you have been able to go to New York, but what also brought great pride to the Armenians is their artistic cultural heritage. And this was on display at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in this wonderful exhibit called Armenia that showed basically examples of Armenian art from many centuries, from the 5th century basically. But for me, I'm a medieval historian as a specialist, and they had a lot of medieval items, which I was very fond of, so that was great. You don't often see those. But in stonework, so that's a stone cross known as a khachkar. In woodwork, which is very rare, those are a pair of doors that were from Surp Garabet and Mush. Also manuscripts, there are a lot of Armenian manuscripts. They're both illuminated and not illuminated, and Armenians are very protective and proud of them. It's an incredible literary history. It's a great illumination too. That's supposed to be God the Father at Genesis. It's wonderful. And also jewelry, metalwork, and that's a beautiful necklace. I think it's supposed to be from the city of Dvin in the 12th century, if I remember correctly. So this was, it brought the president and prime minister of Armenia. The Catholicos came to see the exhibit. Lots of the New York elite were out to see the opening of the exhibit at the Med. It was a huge cultural event, and Armenians were quite proud of it. I'm making a point of this. We're going to return to this again later on about some problems that this raises as well. Okay, so how about where is Armenia? All right, one thing is, I don't have a pointer in this thing. You can see here, this is a map of what were the former Soviet republics of the Caucasus and Central Asia that then became independent. They're now their own countries. But Armenia is sort of this small one here, right? Surrounded by Azerbaijan, Georgia, Iran, and other countries. And you can see it's not a very large country today. But if we're looking historically as to where Armenians lived, particularly in the Ottoman Empire, it was much larger. The current republic corresponds more or less to what the governorate of Yerevan is on that map. So you can see where Armenians lived was a much larger territory throughout what is today eastern Turkey. Now, they weren't necessarily the majority in all of these places, but this is where they were the majority in Van. They were pluralities in many of the other ones, and a significant portion of the population in some of them. So this is the area, when we talk about where Armenians consider a homeland, this is the area that they are talking about. and also where the majority of or nearly all of the genocide occurred. It wasn't limited to those areas, but that's where the majority of the killing was done. Okay, so let's look at Armenians then in the Ottoman Empire and the development of the Armenian genocide, how it came about, before trying to get some lessons from it. So first of all, Armenians on the move. The Ottoman Empire took Western Armenia. They spread from what today is Western Turkey, and they moved eastwards and took what we call Western Armenia in the 16th century. And then there was a long process of incorporating that region into the imperial organization. But beginning in the 18th century, many Armenians, there had been Armenians in Constantinople prior to this, but many of them start moving to the capital city of Constantinople for improved economic reasons. Right there, the Armenian provinces in particular had suffered from war between the Ottoman Empire and the Safavid Empire in Iran, as well as certain local revolts. And so a number of Armenians decided that it was time to move to the big city. Right? Agriculture may not be the way of the future, or they were small business owners in the east, and they decided to move west to the capital in order to raise more money and have a bit more secure life. And by the 19th century, we have quite an affluent urban Armenian class. And it's really, I mean, if you were going to pick one place in the world to be an Armenian in 1850, 1870, Constantinople would be it. It was one of the great cities of the world. You know, various languages were spoken, not just Turkish, Armenian, but also Greek, Italian, Ladino, the language of the Jewish population. Right? You had a very diverse population as well. There was lots of economy, trade, and there was a culture burgeoning. Right? For Armenians themselves, this is when they develop a vernacular literature, a literature that's written in the language that they spoke, not just this classic literature that had been handed down mainly through the church. They had journals where they published works. It was quite exciting. They had important roles in the government. They were the head of the imperial mint. They ran the gunpowder factory. They ran the paper factory in which the currency was made. They were the imperial architects. Right? They owned hotels. So they were very much engaged. They were also getting quite educated. All right, mainly through two means. One was that a lot of them would be sent to Europe to be educated and then come back and try and use the knowledge they had gained there to improve Ottoman life. The other one was Protestant missionaries that started to come mainly from America, but also from Europe, that started to open up schools throughout the Ottoman Empire. And now, because these were religious organizations, the Muslim population couldn't take advantage of them. But the Armenian Christians could. Some of them converted to Protestantism because of that. Many didn't. Others then, the Armenians themselves opened up schools in competition, and also there were Roman Catholic ones as well. So you have a very competitive education sort of environment. And this, what really helped was that also women were educated. And this made a big difference after the genocide, because many of the women who survived and then came as immigrants, particularly to the United States, but to France or Australia, already understood what it meant to be educated. They were already multilingual. They already knew what a classical education was, and they prized it, and they passed it on. So they came with what we call a lot of social capital when they arrived in the various safe havens after the genocide. So this was an exciting time to be an Armenian in Constantinople. There were also a series of reforms that were put into place. These are collectively known as the Tanzimat reforms that the Sultanate had put into place to make life better for everybody. The idea was that there was going to be equality for all citizens of the empire. Education standards would be raised. Transportation would be improved. There would be greater security of life and property. And on paper, all of these things looked very good. And in places like Constantinople and Smyrna in the west, some of these things are actually put into place. But the further east you went, the situation was different. So in the Armenian provinces, where the mass of the Armenian people, the mass of the Armenian population lived, it was a completely different story. Here, most Armenians were agricultural peasants. Right? There were some shop owners, right? There were local businessmen, there were landowners, but the majority were basically agricultural workers. And the reforms that had made life much better for Armenians in Constantinople or Smyrna or even Trebizond were not really doing anything for those Armenians who were living in these areas, where the local population often, the local Muslim or Turkish population or Kurdish population often resented the reforms and thought that they were giving too much favors to the Armenians and taking it away from them. And it was a highly contested region in terms of scarce resources and who controlled the land. There were also other complicated population transfers that were going on at the same time that changed the demographics of the area. So it was an area in flux and an area that had always been competitive in terms of natural resources. And so these reforms were seen to favor the Armenians to the disadvantage of the Turkish and Kurdish Muslims. There was also just a sense of lawlessness and abandonment. We get this repeatedly in Armenian letters to Constantinople from the east saying, would you please enforce the law? And this was important because what happens is that Armenians start to have to enforce the law themselves. They arm themselves, they protect their property. Right? And because there's obviously the central state is not able to provide the stability that one needs to survive. As I said, the Armenians are a majority in Van, plurality in many other areas, and a significant minority in some in those areas. Okay. Now in 1908, things got, there was a little bright spot. Everybody had sort of gotten fed up of the Sultan, Abdul Hamid II, who had launched a series of pogroms in 1895 that killed hundreds of thousands of Armenians. He himself was a little bit not quite right in the head. He was a paranoid, and even his own nephew had defected and called for the removal of the Sultanate, and people had hoped for the institution of a constitutional sultanate. I think that was the great hope, was that what you would have is a parliament with the sultanate, sort of like what you have in England. You have the Queen of England, and the parliament really makes the laws, and they thought they would do the same thing there. And in 1908, this seemed to have almost been a reality. The Young Turks, these are people who, it was really an umbrella group of Ottoman citizens who had had enough of the despotism of the Sultanate and who wanted to install a constitutional government. But they weren't all in agreement over what kind of government it should be. But the Armenians did participate in this, and this are some of the rallies from 1908 in which Armenians celebrated the overthrow of the Sultan and the implementation of a constitutional form of government. But there were problems lurking. As I said, not everybody in the Young Turk movement were on the same page. They were all on the same page about wanting to get rid of the Sultan, but some had very different ideas. And in particularly, the military nationalists known as the Committee of Union and Progress wanted a very different form of government. They wanted what they considered a militaristic government, one that would retain, if not enlarge, Ottoman imperial holdings, right? But that would be much more efficient. And one of the things that was disturbing them was the constant loss that the Ottomans had been suffering in terms of territory due to wars with Europe. And so in 1913, they actually stage a coup where they overthrow the constitutional government. They actually shoot some of the ministers, and they take over. And they're led by three people in particular. Enver Pasha, who's the Minister of War, Talat Pasha, who's the Minister of the Interior and becomes the one who actually institutes the policy of genocide against the Armenians, and Cemal Pasha, who is the Minister of the Navy. This triumvirate basically takes over control of the empire. And they all have different goals, but one of the things is to expand Turkish nationalism. And one way that they think this will be possible is by getting into World War I. It's hard to believe now, but people actually wanted to partake of World War I. I mean, it was a terrible war, it was a horrible war, but people were actually excited to take part in it. So Enver actually signs a secret treaty with Germany And Germany actually wanted Turkey to stay out, wanted the Ottoman Empire to stay out. They did not think that the Ottoman Empire was ready to fight. Even though Germany and the Ottoman Empire had been allied, there was a railroad, the Berlin to Baghdad Railroad that they had been building. Germany was sending them armaments, had been training, helping to train their military. And it's interesting that some of the people, some of the German soldiers who witnessed the Armenian genocide later became camp directors during the Holocaust. So they did learn from their experience in World War I and what happened to the Armenians. But Turkey, as I said, the Ottoman Empire and Enver in particular, did not heed Germany's caution about not joining the war. They jumped in, hoping to be able to unite all of the Turkic peoples from the Mediterranean to the Pacific. And so they would just drive east, wiping out anybody in their way. But he has a very disastrous campaign where he gets defeated by the Russians at the Battle of Sarıkamış in January of 1915. It was freezing cold. Most of the soldiers either were killed, either being shot, or many died of starvation or of hypothermia. All the animals died, the pack animals. It was a complete tactical disaster and logistical nightmare. And on the way back, we don't know if this was premeditated, but he takes the opportunity to blame the Armenians that they were traitors, that they had helped the Russians and defeat the Ottoman forces at Sarıkamış. Very quickly following that, the program for the genocide is put into place. And now it's still a debate about how premeditated the genocide was, meaning, was this something that the CUP and Talat and Enver had been thinking about for a while and just waiting for a moment in which to capitalize so that they could put it into place? Or is it something that sort of came to them in the aftermath of the Battle of Sarıkamış? Seeing how quickly it went into effect, it seems like they did have some idea of how to do this prior to even getting involved in the war. But that is still debated amongst scholars. So, as I said, in February 1915, the first thing that happens is Armenians are told that they're not allowed to carry weapons. One of the things that changed was in 1908, Armenians were able to join the military forces, which they did, and they fought in the Ottoman army. They fought in the Ottoman army in World War I, even after the genocide began. Right? Usually, though, they were moved to work details. Right? The weapons were taken away from them, and they were put into labor battalions. Or they needed people who had specific skills, like tailors. There's a very interesting story about one who was a bugler. They needed a bugler, and he was the only guy who could play the bugle, Alexanian. So the first thing is that they were disarmed, but this also meant there was a reason to go into Armenians' houses. Because they would say, they must have a weapon, so they would break in, and even if it was a hunting rifle that they would use, obviously they're out in rural areas, to shoot for food, that would be used against them. The whole house could be arrested for that. They had to hide any of the weapons that they had. So after February, the Armenians were disarmed. On April 8th, they started deporting Armenians from certain towns that had always been difficult to reach. So Zeytun, the town of Zeytun, is high up in mountainous regions. So they went to areas where there were large Armenian populations before anybody knew anything, so that they could start to get rid of what they knew would be troublesome spots. And then massacres in Van, which had a high Armenian population, started on April 19th. And then, as we said, April 24th, approximately 250 Armenian leaders in Constantinople are arrested, and most are soon executed after that. By 1916, as I said, over 1 million people were dead and 500,000 displaced. And by 1923, 1.5 million people were dead. All right? It was a sizable part of the population, and many more hundreds of thousands forced into exile or forcibly converted. We'll get to this. Okay. So here's a map that shows the density of the Armenian population in 1914, and you can see that this is area, sort of this dark reddish color or orange rusty color. So this is 1914, on the eve of the genocide. That's afterwards, where white means the density afterwards. So you can see in a very short period of time of 12 years how the Armenian population was totally eradicated from that region. All right. So what are the lessons we can learn from this? This is always the challenge, because it is not, obviously I didn't get into history to study death and destruction. That's not the attraction of history. It's not the attraction of culture, right? We look for beauty and for truth. And so what are the lessons? There's got to be something we can take out of this. So I'd like to explore some of those. First is what the Armenian genocide, I think, highlights really well is the intimate connection between genocide and modernity. Right? And as I said here, genocide is a human-made disaster that we must confront as part of our modern and post-modern existence. That is not to say that genocides, mass killings of people, did not happen earlier. They did. But we can see certain aspects of modern genocides distinguish them from earlier mass exterminations of people. And the negative ones, and they're actually negative and positive ones. The positive ones we'll get to. But the negative ones, first of all, is the establishment of the paradigm of genocide. And what I mean is that this is not random killing. As I said, throughout history, there have been plenty of times when there's been chaos, disorder, invading army, and there's really no centralized plan of killing. It happens, but there's no ideology behind the killing. And the paradigm of genocide alters that significantly. The other thing is the use of technology. I mean, we're used to technology being a positive thing, and it is often, but wielded poorly, it's also a terrible thing. And here we see how the technology of the time was used for murderous ends. And then finally, something else that's important is its legalization. Most genocidal regimes legalize the act of murder, of what they're doing, so that the people who are doing it do not feel like they're doing something wrong because the state says it's okay. We've just passed into law that this is what you're able to do. So I think these are the negative parts. The positive ones are, given technology and given the state of affairs at the beginning of the 20th century and today, there's an internationalization. 200 years before, possibly nobody would have known about the Armenian genocide when it happened. Right? The modernity also gives the ability to tell people in large numbers very quickly what's going on. Secondly, the organization that it takes to exterminate a people is the same sort of organization that it takes to save a group of people, right, afterwards. And so we also see the first relief efforts on a mass scale happening with the case of the Armenian genocide. And then finally, also, we have rescuers, people who feel that it's their moral obligation, even if it's not their conflict, right, to stand in the breach and try and save people. Right? And so we'll touch on all of these. The first one being the paradigm of genocide. So first of all, let's say Armenians were first denigrated. Right? This is a common theme. I'm sure many of you have probably studied this in your class, this paradigm. Denigrated as vermin, as a disease. Right? They were a plague. They were parasitical. All right? They're eating out the core of the Ottoman Empire, and therefore, we need to be cleansed of them. Right? Because they're degrading our pure state. There's a pattern to the extermination. Right? It's not just random killing. The men were gathered, usually men were gathered first, and then marched out of town, where they were either shot or bayoneted, if they wanted to save money on bullets. Right? Sometimes they even took them to one town, told them to write their family back home that everything was okay. Then after they did that, then they took them to a second town where they killed them. Okay? The elderly and women and children were then told they would have to leave afterwards. Right? Once the people who would be your natural defense, young men of fighting age, once they were removed, then they went back to take the elderly, the women and children. And these people were marched through the desert, right? Through the desert to towns like Aleppo, and then from Aleppo they were marched along the Euphrates to places like Erasure. And there were camps along the way. That'll be familiar also from other genocides later. And we know this, we also have Turkish soldiers, or I'm sorry, Ottoman soldiers writing. We have the letters of one Arab soldier who writes and says, everything, I'm well, I'm fine, but I don't know what I'm doing because we're marching old women around the desert, like month after month. And he's like, I did not join the army, right? I joined the army to fight, you know, to fight for the Ottoman Empire, not to like march old women through the desert. I don't know what we're doing, right? So we can see that there was a pattern to how these people were going to get executed. And again, simultaneity, only possible in the modern period at this area. Between April and August 1915, the Armenians of nearly every major town and village were deported. As I said, they were killed at a rate of 200,000 a month, right? Almost at the same time. Again, not random, not accidental, but organized and planned. Yeah. Now, how does technology obviously helped with especially with organization? So, the telegraph, right? They didn't have email, they didn't have cell phones, but they did have the recently invented telegraph to communicate orders as to what to do, right? The new railway lines, the Berlin to Baghdad Railroad that was supposed to help with economy and moving of goods, was also used to ship Armenians into the desert, right? They were usually packed in so that they couldn't, you know, they didn't have room to sit down. They would be standing for days in cars where they could hardly breathe. They were often forced to buy the ticket first, and then often the train stopped in the middle of the desert. The people were told to get out, and then they were all killed. Right? So this train, which was supposed to help with communication lines, with help with the economy, here we see it using as death transports. We have a special organization, Tashkilat Masusa, a special branch of the government that's organized and formed specifically to handle the extermination of the Armenians. Right? That they would go through and oversee it. Right? And then finally we see the use of concentration camps. And again, similar to what we will see later, this idea that you need to get this population. And one area study that's just coming into development is the idea of what happened in life in the camps. This hasn't been well studied in the case of the Armenian genocide, but some people are now turning to it. It's a very interesting topic. And in particularly the techniques that the government used to keep Armenians off balance. So what they would normally do in these camps is they would establish a few of the people as the runners, as like the capos, right? As people know from the Holocaust, who would be the ones who were in power in the camp and decide who gets the best place to live, right? Furthest away from the latrines. Who gets the most room, who gets food and all of that. Right? Obviously, that is a person who is going to attract a lot of ill feeling from a lot of people. So what they would do is when they would move them to the next camp, they would flip it. They would take the people who were in the worst part of the previous camp and now make them the leaders of the next camp, which you can imagine created tensions in the population. But this is still an area where scholars are being able to look at memoirs and seeing how the actual operation of the camps went. But it was obviously it was a very nasty business all around. Okay, legalization, as I said, a very important aspect of genocide. So between May and December of 1915, there were a series of laws that authorized the deportation of Armenians, and most importantly, from the Ottoman perspective, from the CUP perspective, secured and registered the property of Armenians while they were being relocated. So basically, they passed laws saying, oh, these people aren't here, the state can take the property. If these people don't return by a certain time, the property devolves upon the state, right? And they had really complicated registers. They had books where you would go as an Armenian before you were deported, and you would make a list of all of the things you had. And they would write it down, and the authority in the town would sign against everything. and another copy was made and sent to Constantinople to be put into the archive. So they knew exactly what everybody had and how much money was out there. Right? And knowing full well, and there would be a line saying, if you return, before 1 year from now, you can have your property back, knowing full well that none of these people were going to come back. And this was part of the basis for many of these people, before they left, insured their property with insurance companies like New York Life. And this was a big lawsuit a few years ago where the descendants sued the insurance companies for not paying them on the loss of the property. They created an Abandoned Properties Administration Commission, which reported every 15 days. Every 15 days. And basically, every 2 weeks, the central government was getting a report on the properties that the state was accumulating from killing and deporting and killing these people. And then they administered the liquidation of Armenian properties and created a liquidation commission, because now the government is in control of all of this land, right? It can now distribute it to the people it wants to. Right? They can keep it for themselves. I mean, Talat Pasha himself, his own accounts, right? 20,545 buildings, 260,000, over 267,000 acres of land. Over 76,000 acres of vineyards, over 700,000 acres of olive groves, over 5,500 acres of mulberry gardens were confiscated. And this was in a little black book that he had on him when he was finally hunted down later by an Armenian, Solomon Tehlirian, who saw him in Germany after the war and killed him. Right? So he was hanging on to this book. Right, you could sort of see him going over every night, oh, this is how much stuff we have. Right? He would never get to see it again, but nonetheless, that is a lot of capital that was acquired. Okay, now the positive side, the internationalization. Although it may not seem prominent to you today, when it was happening, it was quite a known event, and especially afterwards. So in nearly 200 articles in the New York Times between 1915 and 1922. You have to remember that the United States was formally neutral in World War I until the end. So we still had representatives there. And particularly Henry Morgenthau, our ambassador to Turkey, he wrote down what was going on and kept a journal about it. He talked to Talat Pasha, all right, and asked him, why are you doing this? And according to Henry Morgenthau, Talat Pasha said, if you think if we let one of them live, will they, that they won't grow up to exact revenge upon us. Right? So, I mean, he was engaged in dialogue about that. He finally had to leave at the end because of our entrance into the war. But it was not unknown. Americans knew very well. And then even afterwards, there was a very famous book, Franz Werfel's 40 Days of Musadach, about one episode during the genocide that became an international bestseller. It was translated into dozens of languages. So this was a known event, and there was a huge amount of relief effort dedicated towards it. Right? So that it founded the American Committee for Relief in the Near East, which then became the Near East Relief Fund. Right? And this was between 1916 to 1930. The United States raised $116 million of relief money, which is the equivalent of $1.5 billion today, approximately. That is the largest relief effort ever. And this is the first time, really, that you got an international relief campaign of this scale. And also that involved presidents, politicians, and celebrities. And this is a little news clipping of how Babe Ruth, right, gave one of his baseball bats that hit a home run to be auctioned to help Armenian orphans. Right, that's the level of notoriety it had. People were very aware that this happened. And that was only possible, again, due to the technological advances that had been made in the late 19th and early 20th century. And then there were rescuers, people who dedicated themselves to saving life. And some of the most famous were Danish missionaries, Maria Jakobsen and Karen Jeppe, who are still, these are stamps from the Republic of Armenia. They're still highly regarded figures in Armenia, as well as amongst the diaspora. Right? And then Stanley Kerr. That name sound familiar? Yeah, Golden State Warriors coach's grandfather, Steve Kerr's grandfather, was also very much involved in relief efforts and rescuing people. And then there were, what we call maybe righteous Turks and Kurds, people whose conscience did not allow them to just sit back and let this happen. And it took various different forms. Usually it could be like elites. As I said, Armenians were very much integrated into the Ottoman Empire. They were not a foreign, this is why it was so drastic for them. It wasn't as though they necessarily felt on the outside. These were people they knew often. Talat Pasha had Armenian friends who went to him and asked, "Can you save my family?" And he's like, "I'll try. I'll do what I can. I can save you. I don't know if I can save your wife and children." But we have elites ignoring or minimizing orders. That is, they get the order to kill everybody, but they keep pushing it off so that they don't have to do it. Sometimes they would tell Armenians ahead of time, "Listen, go now, just get out of here. This is going to happen. It's best if you get away." Some of them hid Armenians in their houses. Some of them provided food on marches. And then, I don't know if this is why that didn't come out. On the bottom there, it should say, some adopted Armenian children. This is controversial. But many of them said, the parents aren't going to make it, but we will take your children. Right? We'll take your daughter, we'll take your son, and we'll raise them in our family. And therefore, they saved people. And we'll get back to this later as well. Okay, the other thing that I think, other than that, the Armenian genocide is very much tied up with modernity, and one of the reasons to pay attention to it is that we should also remember that genocidal regimes, it's not just one people. It's never limited. It's always part of a larger ideology of murder. Right? And so in the Armenian genocide too, Assyrian Christians also suffered tremendously. Contemporary reports record between 200 and 250,000 killed in southeast Turkey and the Urmia region of Iran between 1915 and 1923, and it could be as high as 400,000. We don't have exact numbers, right? But it was over half their population was wiped out. Many of them were very much integrated into Armenian communities with Armenian families. So some of it was a natural continuation of the Armenian genocide, but they were also communities that were completely separate that were targeted for extermination. And likewise, the Greek genocide. Where, again, the numbers range from 450 to 900,000. And the most famous example is possibly the catastrophe at Smyrna in 1922, where up to 100,000 Greeks and Armenians were killed. The old city was intentionally set on fire in a ring, and the population driven to the sea. And most people couldn't swim, and they wound up either burning to death or drowning. So it was a huge catastrophe. Now this is remembered as sort of the three sort of genocides that did happen at the same time, and they are recognized by both the International Association of Genocide Scholars in 2007, and then the Republic of Armenia, in commemoration of the centenary of the Armenian genocide, also officially recognized the Assyrian and Greek genocides as occurring at the same time. And there's a new book that's coming out. I think it may have just come out. I haven't seen it yet, but that it's looking at the genocide of Christians by the Ottoman Empire at this period, that's taking in all of the communities. Okay, 3. Now, obviously, the loss of life is the biggest disaster of any genocide. But we can't forget or overlook the cultural erasure. That is the deliberate erasing of a culture that continues afterwards, and we'll get to that as well. So not only were 1.5 million people killed, but we also have thousands of monuments destroyed. So these are two famous monasteries in Armenia. The first one, Surp Gadabed at Mush, from which those doors came from, and the bottom one of Varak. These are pictures from before the genocide, and this are more recent pictures afterwards. You can see they've been totally obliterated. The one at Varak actually was being used as a storeroom for building materials. Place names are changed. It's one of the good ways of trying to erase memory of a culture is you change their names of what places are called. As I've already mentioned, the appropriation of capital All the wealth that had been accumulated by these people and families is taken away and redistributed elsewhere. And then there was forced conversion and assimilation of survivors. Again, this is a new sort of topic. People have always known that this happened, but we don't really know the numbers as to how many people were forcibly converted. Some of them, it seems, did it voluntarily in the sense of they tried to get ahead of the game by doing it. Some of them were women and children who had been sold or were taken by Kurdish tribal families or even Turkish families and raised as part of the family. People are now in Turkey discovering their Armenian roots, particularly in eastern Turkey and particularly amongst the Kurdish population, saying, I've had an Armenian grandmother, right, who never talked about it. They usually changed their name, and maybe they remembered a couple of words in Armenian that they never spoke to anybody. But the other interesting thing is that people were aware of who had an Armenian ancestor, and those children were not allowed to marry or never did marry with children of people who were of pure Turkish descent. The idea that your ancestor was or had been a convert was remembered over generations. But this is something that's coming to the fore now. We don't know how many people this happened to. Estimates range between 50 and 250,000 people, which if now you're looking at 100 years later, how much of the population could that be? But we really don't have accurate numbers, and it's becoming interesting to see people start to talk about this and how they're dealing with the fact that this may be part of their story when they didn't know. And then obviously one of the big ones, just denial of history. And not just denial, I mean, there's obviously the denial of the genocide itself. For a long time, there was also denial of Armenians' presence in the region. Because of course, if they were there and they did things, then how do you explain the fact that they just disappeared? But I think most troublesome for me is that it moves on, so that we deny our own history. I went through and listed all these great things that America did to help Armenians. How many people in the room heard that growing up? How many people learned about that in school? We don't talk about it at all. And it's not as though, all right, World War I, all right, it's World War I. It's not some sort of small event that happened in this, 1783. It's World War I. All right, this is the largest relief effort ever. And we don't talk about it. We don't talk about the efforts that the United States tried to do in order to stop this. I mean, this is a positive history. Right? Could we have done more? We don't know. But it's that denial of then even our own history in order not to have to come to terms with what happened to the Armenian population in the Ottoman Empire. So it's an even larger issue. And this also gets to the exhibit Armenia at the Met. And I showed you those beautiful objects before, and here are some more. But those are the same doors at Mush. Here's an ur at Ani. Another relic also from eastern Turkey, and then gospel books from the Van region, right? Now, one of the criticisms of the exhibit is nowhere does it explain why those things are not where they were made. Why do you need to get these doors that were done in Mush from a private collector who is in the United States? Why is this ur from Ani in the Museum of the Republic of Armenia in Yerevan? And not in Ani, in eastern Turkey, or at the museum in Van, right? Why did that have to leave? That whole process, and what is our role now? When we go to view these objects, and we realize that in some way they're part of a culture that has been erased in its place of origin, what is our responsibility with that? And they were, it was a debated question. It was one of the criticisms that was raised by Armenians about the exhibit, that at no point is there a map shown in the exhibit? Because then if you have a map, you have to say where everything is. Even though there is an interactive map online, which is very good. It's an excellent one. They did a wonderful job with that. And then nowhere did they explain the provenance of these items. How did it get from point A to point B, and why? Why are these items now all over the world? Right? And that's a much bigger issue. Right? And that it still continues to this day, right? That culture of denial, right? And that's part of the continued legacy, right, where this vital cultural and economic sector of Anatolia in the Middle East was completely destroyed. Right? And it's not, it's now dispersed. Right? It also became part of the economic basis for the Republic of Turkey. Right? People like to say, well, it was the Ottoman Empire, not the Republic of Turkey. Yes, but the foundations of the Republic of Turkey are built, right, on the genocide. And even though Ataturk, originally, he's the founder of the modern republic, admitted that this had happened to the Armenians, he realized very quickly that he had to silence this in order for his republic to be constructed. It also instigated diasporas. All of those great people that we were looking at before, whether it was William Saroyan or Charles Aznavour, right, or even System of a Down, and all of those are the product of the Armenian genocide. If it's not for the Armenian genocide, they would be working and living, most of them, I would presume, in Turkey, where their families were from, where their ancestral land was. Right? So all of these diaspora communities are a continued legacy of what happened in 1915. And this also began the process of ethnic cleansing of the Middle East. It's not just 100 years ago. As we see, it has continued to this day. The actual strength of the Middle East, historically, as a cultural center, has always rested in the very fact that it has many, many different peoples and many, many different languages with many, many different faiths. They've not always gotten along. It's always been a bit of a mess. But it was that vibrancy of difference that led it to have such wonderful creations and productivity. As that becomes less and less, right, as the different groups and minority groups start to disappear, right, that will have an overall negative effect on the entire region. So we see this continuity of destruction, right, even to this day. Whether it's with the Mar Elian Monastery in Syria, right, as Assyrian or Syriac Christian monuments are coming under attack, or in 2005, the continued destruction of Armenian culture in the province of Nakhchivan, which is is now part of the Republic of Azerbaijan, right, where they systematically destroyed thousands of those cross stones. I showed a picture of one of those earlier. Thousands of them were destroyed and ground up into cement. Right? And we also see it in the perpetuation of conflict. So the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, a war that technically went from 1988 to 1993, but it's never been ended. Right? There's still no treaty. There's no resolution. It's still a tense area between the Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh, which is right next to Armenia, and the Republic of Azerbaijan. But this is seen and is spoken of in terms of a continuation of what happened in 1915 by both sides. Right? The Turkish and Azerbaijani governments see this as a way to finish up what was started in 1915, and the Armenians see it as precisely the same thing, a continuation of what was started then, to eliminate all Armenian traces from the area. And then we have repeated images. I always show this. Here's a Yazidi refugee from 2014, and there's an Armenian refugee from approximately 100 years earlier. And it's amazing, with all the changes that have happened in the past century, that this still remains the same. Right? The people who suffer the same way, marching through the desert with everything they have.